Several years ago, I found myself in a prison camp, in a tiny prison cell in North Vietnam. That cell was 8 feet long and 8 feet wide. I remember distinctly the dimensions of that cell. I could pace 3 steps in one direction before I ran into a wall. Then I had the opportunity of turning around and pacing 3 steps the other way. Inside my new little home, I had nothing to do. I had no books to read, no window to look out, no TV, telephone, BlackBerry, Bluetooth. I didn't have a pencil or a piece of paper. For 2,103 days. That equates to age 24 to age 30 in my life. I spent 6 Christmases, 6 birthdays in a tiny prison cell a long way from home. And I think the most value I can be in the few minutes we're together is to invite you into my little prison cell. You see, there's a great deal to be learned here. So for the next few moments, I'd like for you to try your best to smell the stench of that 2-gallon bucket in the corner I call my toilet. I'd like you to try to feel the baking heat of a tropical summer in a tin-roof prison cell 10,000 miles away from the good life. I'd like you to try to taste the salt, the annoying taste of salt in the corners of your mouth from the sweat and the tears and the blood. Not that you'll ever be prisoners of war, God forbid. But I hope you'll understand that the same kinds of challenges, in fact, maybe the biggest challenges you face in your life are the same challenges that I faced in mine. And more importantly, your response to the challenge, if you're going to succeed, has to be the same recipe of responses I used over there just to survive and thrive. And one more thing. If this is already too great a stretch for you, if you're already having trouble bridging this gap in time and geography between my life experience and your own, the best I can offer you is an interesting war story. But here's the connect. Here's the touch point. You see, there's not a person here who has not in the last few weeks or months felt lonely and alone. Your support group is gone. You're having trouble communicating even with those you love the most. You feel defeated and put upon. The mountain is just too high. So step into my little prison cell, and I'll try to explain to you the ways that you survive those prisons. Because you see, as the minutes wore into hours, and the hours wore into days, and the days wore into weeks and months in that little prison cell, I found that you learn to acclimate. You learn how to breathe deeply and think about things far away, sunny beaches, warm breezes, thoughts of home. And you know what happens? You get so comfortable in your little prison cell that the last place you want to go is outside the cell because it's dark and lonely out here. At least you know the devil in the light. What happens is you get a restriction built up, and it's not the 8 feet between the walls. It's the 8 inches between your ears. You're in a mental box. Ever been in one of those mental boxes? We all get there. I'm convinced that you can be in a mental box with something so insignificant, have one of your friends unfriend you, or something as major as the loss of a child. How do you survive those little 8-inch prisons in your mind? I was one of 571 men who came out of the prison camps in Vietnam. What would you expect? What would you think of guys who were held in prison the longest in American history? 5, 6, 7, 8.5 years of my buddy Ev Alvarez. Would you expect us to be somehow mentally deranged, full of hate and bitterness, unable to go on with a normal life? Well, that's what the psychiatrists thought. And the psychologists, they had our families briefed to institutionalize us the rest of our lives. That's what they thought was coming home from the prison camps of Vietnam. I'm happy to tell you that we are setting records. We're surprising a lot of people. In fact, there was a study done just a few years ago that's represented in a book called Lessons from the Hanoi Hilton by Taylor Keeland. The book says that of all the combatants of Vietnam, 30.6% have post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Of the prisoners of war, 4% of us have post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, they've come up with a new term. It's called PTG, post-traumatic growth, that we actually survived and thrived because of the challenge we faced. How do you do that? What's the secret? Well, I think number one, you have to keep your parachute packed. Number two, you have to drop an anchor. And number three, you have to tug on a wire. I'll explain that. I sat down in a restaurant several years after I came home. About 2 tables over, I noticed a guy looking at me. I didn't recognize him. He stood up, walked over to my table, pointed at me. He said, "You're Captain Plumb." I said, "Yes, sir, I'm Captain Plumb." "You're that guy. You flew jet fighters in Vietnam. Fighter pilot, part of the Top Gun school, shot down, parachuted into enemy hands. You spent 6 years as a prisoner of war." Somewhat dumbfounded, I looked up at this guy and I said, "How in the world did you know all that?" He finally broke into a smile and he said, "Because I packed your parachute." Tell you this, I was dumbfounded. Best I could do was stagger to my feet, reach out a very grateful hand of thanks. He came up with just the proper words. The guy grabbed my hand, he pumped my arm, and he said, "I guess it worked." Well, we spent a lot of time that night talking. This guy was very humble. He said, "I'm not the only one that packed your parachute. Oh yes, I did the physical job. What about your mental parachute? How about your psychological parachute? How about your spiritual parachute? Somebody else packed those." And it's very true. Early on, my mother taught me a lot about forgiveness. My father taught me a lot about discipline. He said discipline would bring me freedom. And I would use both of those wonderful people in my life that packed my parachute in surviving and thriving in that prison camp. And in school, a coach I'll never forget named Smith, after a very losing season, I'm wandering off to the locker room and I felt this arm over my sweaty shoulder and I said, "I'm sorry, coach, I guess this team's just a bunch of losers." And he squeezed my shoulder and he sunk his fingernails into the flesh and he said, "Son, whether you think you're a loser or whether you think you're a winner, you're right." And he was right. Life is a choice, regardless of where you go and the challenges you face. You can choose happiness or sadness. You can choose profit or loss. You can choose health or sickness. You can choose life or death. And you can choose to give away all those other choices. At the Naval Academy, I learned a lot there. I got a degree in engineering from the Naval Academy. Learned how to drive ships around the Chesapeake Bay. And those instructors taught me the value of an anchor. An anchor stabilizes a ship in stormy weather. And the chaplains there taught me the value of an anchor in life. In those challenging times when you need stabilization, you need the focus, you need a reason to be, you need a purpose in life. That anchor holds you steady. And even in the prison camp, the parachute packers just came out of the shadows of my life in that prison camp. I was pacing along there a couple 100 miles into my experience. I heard in the far corner the chirping noise of a cricket. I walked over to check it out. No cricket at all, but a piece of wire about that long, poked through a hole at the base of the cell wall and scratching on my concrete floor, making this chirping noise like a cricket. I knew the enemy was not sophisticated enough to try to trick me. That meant on the other end of that wire had to be another fighter pilot, like me. Boy, would I like to talk to another fighter pilot. Could we tell some stories? But I'll bet that guy's tougher than I am. He's probably older, more mature, a better pilot, and he probably didn't cry when they tortured him like I did. I'm losing interest now. Ever get that way? You know, when that mental box starts to come in on you, the last thing you want to do is take a risk. The last thing you want to do is tug on a wire. And I thought to myself, I'll just crawl over here in the corner of this prison cell and wait. Surely in a few years, they'll break down the gates and I'll be set free and I'll never have to take another risk the rest of my life. And the wire kept scratching and I kept sweating. And I finally had to reach down and grab that wire and tug. The wire tugged back. I tugged again and it disappeared right back through that rat hole. But it came back about an hour later, this time a note wrapped around the end of the wire. The note had a code written on it where we could tug on the wire representing various letters of the alphabet or abbreviations, and we could communicate, which was a godsend. Just to have the validation of another human being knowing that I was alive and caring about me. Bob Shoemaker was on the other end of that wire, fighter pilot extraordinaire, astronaut candidate, but better than that, here's a parachute packer. He'd been in that prison camp for 2 years when I showed up, a total of over 8 years for Bob Shoemaker. I said, how in the world do you survive this? He said, well, you will find that you've just joined the finest team you'll ever play on. You will see the best example of leadership in the world right here in this prison camp. Our leaders can't talk to us. They can't fire us. They can't hire us. They can't give us a bonus. And yet they've redefined our mission here. They've given us an anchor. We are still combatants here. We are not on the defensive. We are warriors, and we will fight this war to our last dying breath. And I said, okay, but what does it take? He said, well, you have to be a believer. He said, I'm not a preacher. I'm not going to try to convert you to a religion, but you have to have faith. You have to have faith in your team, the other prisoners of war in this camp. You have to have faith in your flag, in your country. You have to have that reason, that purpose in life. And our purpose here is to fight this war till our last dying breath. Well, he sure packed my parachute that day. I don't think I'd be alive today if it hadn't been for Bob Shoemaker. The war ended. We came home after many years in that prison camp. They thought we'd be in baskets. Well, we're setting records. From 591 men, we have produced 17 generals and 7 admirals. Most of us retired as senior grade military officers. We went back to flying airplanes and commanding fleets around the world. We have doctors and lawyers and preachers and teachers, congressmen, 2 United States senators, 2 ambassadors from our number, a vice presidential candidate, a presidential candidate, and they're telling us today we're healthier mentally and physically than if we hadn't been through that experience. What does that mean to you? You'll never be prisoners of war. I hope and pray none of you ever face that 8-foot box, but you will face the 8-inchers. We all get there. Good, bad, ugly. We're all there. How do you escape? How do you survive and even thrive through that experience? Well, I'm convinced you have to keep your parachute packed. You have to have that baseline foundation from your family, from your coaches, from your team, from your community, from your nation. And you have to drop that anchor. Be sure that you have a purpose in life. Be sure that there's a focus to your very being, a raison d'etre, as the French say. And you have to tug on wires, even in the midst of that challenge. You have to step into the fray. You have to embrace that challenge. And if you can do those things, you can escape every 8-inch prison in your life. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.